They promised me the promotion. Not verbally, no, that would have been too easy to deny. It was written. An email straight from my regional director, pending final review, you're the leading candidate for regional manager. Let's plan for transition by Q3. That email was sent 2 months ago. So imagine my confusion when I walked into the conference room and saw Brian, smug, cocky, leaning back like he owned the place, getting congratulated by the execs. I froze. And that's when it hit me. Brian wasn't just my co-worker. He was my friend. My best friend at the office. We used to grab beers after long shifts. He was the one I confided in about my plans. About my interview strategies. About that one screw-up I begged him not to repeat to anyone. Now? He was the one taking the job that was mine. If you've ever trusted someone at work, only to feel the knife twist in your back, you're not alone. Hit that subscribe button and stick with me, because this story? It spirals into something much darker than just office betrayal. It became personal. It almost cost me my sanity. And by the end, I exposed something no one in that company saw coming. Let me walk you through it, step by step. How I lost everything. And then flipped the entire company on its head. At first, I tried to convince myself there had been a mistake. Some sort of internal mix-up. Maybe HR hadn't finalized things yet, or perhaps the promotion was still unofficial. But when I approached my boss, calmly, professionally, all he said was, "Brian's got the leadership qualities we're looking for." We reevaluated after new concerns came to light. Concerns? What concerns? That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept going over every project I led, every deadline I met, and I killed it this year. I even worked through my mom's surgery, juggling meetings from the hospital cafeteria. So what the hell changed? The next morning, I cornered Linda, our office manager and someone I'd always gotten along with. I asked her, off the record, if she'd heard anything. She looked uncomfortable. And then she said something that made my stomach turn. Word around is that you've been distracted, emotionally unstable. And that you left a client meeting midway because you were hungover. That was a lie. The meeting she referenced? I had to leave because of a family emergency. I even told Brian about it. He was the only one who knew the full story. I started connecting the dots. Little rumors. Private moments twisted into gossip. Mistakes I never made suddenly getting brought up. It wasn't just sabotage. It was a campaign. Someone had been quietly building a case against me for weeks. And the deeper I dug, the more I realized, Brian had been planning this from the start. I couldn't believe it at first. Brian? The guy who covered for me when I was running late? The guy who toasted with me after I landed the Johnson account? It felt impossible. But the signs were there, hiding in plain sight. I went back through my messages with him. Buried in our Slack history were seemingly casual questions. "Didn't you say you hated working with Carol from legal? Wait, weren't you the one who botched that compliance form last month?" At the time, I thought he was just being chatty. Now I saw it differently. He was gathering intel, framing me with my own words, twisting them into ammunition. I started asking around. Carefully. Quietly. And that's when Jamie from HR pulled me aside and said something chilling. "Between you and me, Brian came to us weeks ago. Said he was worried about you. Mentioned your mom, your stress levels, even hinted you were drinking on the job." I stared at her, jaw clenched. I had never drank at work. Not once. Brian had weaponized my personal life, my vulnerabilities, to paint a picture of instability. And the worst part? He was smart about it. He never outright accused me. He just planted seeds, making it seem like he was concerned. The more I investigated, the clearer it became. He wasn't just trying to climb the ladder. He was trying to shove me off it. And if I didn't act fast, he was going to bury me completely. I needed proof. Without it, I'd look like a paranoid employee who couldn't handle being passed over. But the idea that Brian had been plotting this, possibly for months, consumed me. Every shared joke, every beer after work, every "man, you've got this promotion in the bag" suddenly felt fake. He'd studied me, learned my weaknesses, and then used them to orchestrate my downfall. I started documenting everything. I took screenshots of our old messages. I noted down dates, when I left early, who I told, and who could confirm. I even checked office security footage to back up my timeline. Then, I remembered something critical. 2 weeks before the promotion was announced, Brian asked me to review his quarterly projections. I didn't think much of it then, but when I reopened the file, I noticed something strange. He had copied sections from my proposal, The one I submitted to corporate weeks earlier. I ran a comparison. Line for line, paragraph for paragraph. My data. My phrasing. My analysis. All lifted, with a few words changed here and there. He didn't just sabotage me. He stole my work. It was like I'd been stabbed and robbed in the same breath. I wanted to confront him. But I couldn't blow it now, not without solid backup. So I played dumb. Pretended I hadn't figured anything out. And while he celebrated his promotion, I was busy building a case. If Brian thought I was done, he had no idea who he was dealing with. The first step was risky. I scheduled a congratulatory lunch with Brian. He walked in smug as ever, like the king of the castle. I forced a smile and handed him a drink. "To your promotion," I said, raising my glass. He clinked it without hesitation. I watched him sip. We talked casually, or so he thought. I steered the conversation toward the Johnson account, the one that secured my original candidacy. He laughed. "You practically gift-wrapped that deal for the company." "Yeah," I said, keeping my tone even. "Still remember every line of that pitch." I dropped a key phrase, a line I used in my proposal that Brian had also used in his final presentation. His eyes flickered for half a second. "Gotcha." After lunch, I went straight to IT. I knew one of the guys there, Marcus, from a volunteer project. I told him I suspected intellectual property theft and that my work might have been accessed without authorization. He hesitated but agreed to help me off the record. What we found was damning. Brian had logged into the shared drive at 1:42 a.m. 3 weeks ago, 2 hours after I uploaded my final report. He'd downloaded my file, opened it, and made changes under a generic temp account. The metadata didn't lie. I finally had what I needed. Now I just had to decide, take it to HR quietly, or light the whole thing on fire. I didn't know it yet, but this decision? It would define the rest of my career. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, staring at the evidence. The printouts. The timestamps. The comparison reports. All of it pointing to one undeniable truth: Brian didn't just beat me, he cheated his way to the top. And somehow, that made it hurt worse. I wasn't angry about the title anymore. I was angry about the betrayal. I trusted this guy like a brother. When my mom was hospitalized, he was the one who sent me takeout and told me to take care of myself. It all felt so real back then. Was it all part of the act? I felt hollow. Used. Like a stepping stone in someone else's climb. I nearly called HR right then and there. But something stopped me. A quiet voice in my head, not angry, not impulsive. Strategic. Because what Brian did wasn't just unethical. It was illegal. And if I played this right, I could not only take him down, I could build something stronger in its place. So I made a plan. First, I compiled a formal report, evidence of document theft, slander, and manipulation. I sent it anonymously to the company's legal department and CC'd the ethics committee. Then I waited. And while I waited, I did something Brian never expected. I began reaching out to his supporters, the very coworkers he'd manipulated, one by one. Not to accuse him, but to listen. And what I heard. It changed everything. I started with Carol in legal, the same woman Brian claimed I hated working with. I invited her to coffee, and to my surprise, she accepted. The moment I brought up Brian, cautiously, just in passing, her expression shifted. Not surprise. Not admiration. Disgust. "Let me guess," she said. "He finally threw you under the bus?" That stopped me cold. She leaned in and told me a story that made my skin crawl. Apparently, 2 months ago, Brian blamed a budgeting error on her during a board meeting. But she had the receipts, literally. When she confronted him privately, he gaslit her. Told her she was overreacting, maybe burned out. Her eyes narrowed. He's slick. And he always makes sure someone else gets the blame. I didn't realize it until then, but I wasn't the only one. Brian had a pattern. He exploited trust, twisted narratives, and climbed over people like stepping stones. I reached out to 3 others, people who had always kept their heads down, never involved in office drama. Each one had a story. A missed promotion, a failed project, a performance warning they didn't deserve, all connected to Brian somehow. Suddenly, this wasn't just about revenge. It was about justice. I wasn't alone anymore. And as we shared stories, something else emerged, a collective will to expose him. Not just to HR, but to everyone. The man who built his career on betrayal had left a trail of broken people behind him. Now, we were ready to fight back. We formed an unofficial alliance, a quiet, strategic coalition of co-workers who'd all been burned by Brian. We weren't loud. We weren't reckless. We were calculated. Each of us dug through old files, emails, meeting notes, anything that could show a pattern of manipulation. Carol pulled archived meeting logs that contradicted Brian's claims. Jamie found outdated task records that proved Brian had lied about her missing a deadline last quarter. I compiled screenshots, Slack messages, and timestamps from the shared drive Brian raided. It wasn't just petty office politics anymore. It was a full-blown case of professional misconduct, maybe even corporate fraud. We packaged everything into a digital dossier. Timeline. Evidence. Multiple witness statements. We didn't accuse, we showed. Every claim backed by proof. Every pattern documented. And then, we leaked it. Not to the press. Not to social media. But to the one place we knew leadership couldn't ignore, the company's internal ethics board, and the executive inbox. It was a calculated move. The kind that can either burn you to the ground, or finally shine a light on everything hiding in the dark. Then came the hardest part, we waited. For days, nothing happened. Brian walked around like royalty, shaking hands, holding meetings in my old office. But on Monday morning, at exactly 9:17 a.m., an all-staff email hit our inboxes. An internal investigation is underway regarding ethical violations and misconduct. Affected parties will be contacted. Brian didn't show up that day. And the silence that followed? It was louder than any words. For the next 2 weeks, the office felt like it was holding its breath. Meetings were hushed. Side conversations stopped when doors opened. And Brian? Nowhere to be found. At first, there were rumors. Medical leave. Family emergency. Burnout. But those of us in the know? We weren't buying it. One by one, we were pulled into formal interviews, HR, legal, even a third-party auditor. They asked precise questions, pointed questions. Not just about Brian's behavior, but about ours. What we saw. What we experienced. What we knew and when we knew it. I brought everything. Not just documents, but context. How Brian sowed doubt, twisted facts, and manipulated perceptions over years. They listened. Took notes. Asked me to forward the files, and asked if I'd be willing to testify if it escalated. I said yes. Without hesitation. Then came the bombshell. A week later, our division VP held an emergency meeting. It was short and clinical, HR speak, all formal language. But the message was clear. Due to multiple violations of company policy, including misrepresentation, manipulation of internal records, and unethical behavior toward colleagues, Brian M. is no longer employed with this organization. No thank you. No farewell. Just erased. There was no round of applause. No cheers. Just stunned silence. But afterward, as we filtered out, Carol looked over and whispered, "You did it." I didn't feel victorious. Not yet. Because the damage Brian caused didn't vanish with his exit. It lingered. In trust lost. In wounds reopened. And in what came next, when corporate tried to clean up the mess. Without taking any responsibility. Brian was gone. But the story didn't end there. If anything, it got murkier. At first, I expected some kind of reckoning. An apology. A public acknowledgement of the chaos he caused. Something to validate the months, years, of silent suffering. Instead, corporate doubled down on damage control. Not to help us. To protect themselves. They released a sanitized statement to the entire staff. After a thorough internal review, it has been determined that recent leadership transitions were necessary to ensure company integrity and maintain team cohesion. Team cohesion? Brian tore people apart. He turned coworkers into enemies. He nearly destroyed careers. And now they were pretending it was just a leadership transition? I was furious. But I kept my cool. I met with the VP privately, not as a whistleblower, but as a professional. I laid out my concerns. How this wasn't just about Brian, it was about the culture that let him thrive. The fear. The silence. The way people like Carol and Jamie were punished for speaking up. He nodded, said all the right things. Promised training initiatives, open-door policies, a shift in values. But it all felt performative. Like they weren't fixing the leak, just repainting the ceiling. So I made a decision. If the company wouldn't hold itself accountable, maybe someone else would. I reached out to a journalist I trusted. Not to destroy the company, but to tell the truth. Because the real story wasn't just about Brian. It was about how good people are crushed when no one's watching. Reaching out to a journalist was a huge step, one that made me nervous beyond belief. I knew there would be risks, backlash from my employer, potential legal headaches, and the uncertainty of exposing a story so close to home. But I also knew that staying silent meant letting everything I and my colleagues went through vanish without consequence. The journalist was thorough and professional. She listened to every detail, asked sharp questions, and requested documents, all of which I provided. We agreed to keep my identity confidential for as long as possible to protect me from retaliation. When the story finally went live, it sent shockwaves through the industry. Not just a story of one toxic employee, but a deep dive into the corporate culture that enabled him. Employees came forward, anonymously sharing their experiences. A few even reached out to me personally. The company tried to manage the damage with carefully worded PR statements, but the public pressure was undeniable. Internal investigations were reopened, leadership changes accelerated, and a new focus on transparency was promised. Meanwhile, I felt a complicated mix of relief and apprehension. Relief because I'd finally broken the silence. Apprehension because I was still navigating the aftermath, the fractured trust, the lost friendships, and the question of what came next for me. Through it all, one thing was clear: I'd chosen to fight back, not just for myself but for everyone Brian had hurt. And the fight was far from over. After the story broke and the dust started settling, I found myself at a crossroads. I was no longer the person who had walked into that office, full of hope and trust. The experience had changed me, sharpened me in ways I hadn't expected. I spent weeks reflecting on what happened. Why I had been so blindsided. How I let someone I trusted manipulate me. But more importantly, what I could learn moving forward. I realized that workplace politics are a brutal battlefield, and sometimes, the biggest threat comes from the people closest to you. But I also learned that silence is the enemy. I started rebuilding relationships, cautiously, with coworkers who stuck by me. We formed a support network, not just to survive but to thrive. I took steps to improve my own emotional resilience and communication skills, making sure I could spot red flags earlier next time. Eventually, I began applying to new roles, ones where integrity and respect weren't just buzzwords but core values. The interviews weren't easy. I had to explain what happened without sounding bitter or defeated. But I was honest. And it resonated. I realized this chapter wasn't the end of my story, it was the catalyst for a new beginning. And if you're watching this now, struggling with betrayal or toxic coworkers, here's what I want you to take away. You can rise above it. You can fight back. And you deserve a workplace where your trust isn't weaponized against you. If you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this, because sometimes, the hardest battles are the ones we don't talk about. Just when I thought the worst was behind me, something unexpected surfaced. While reviewing internal emails I'd obtained during the investigation, I noticed a pattern, a shadow lurking behind Brian's moves. There was a name that kept appearing in meetings, memos, and emails that seemed unrelated at first. But the more I looked, the more it seemed like someone higher up was quietly pulling strings, encouraging Brian's underhanded tactics to eliminate competition. This person wasn't just a bystander or a distant manager. It was Mark, the division's senior director, the very person who had the final say on promotions. Mark had always struck me as smooth and unshakable, the kind of guy who smiled while plotting. And apparently, Brian was his pawn. I confronted Carol and Jamie about this, and they confirmed their suspicions. Mark was known for rewarding loyalty and punishing anyone who questioned him. He kept his hands clean by having people like Brian do the dirty work. It was a whole new level of betrayal. Not just a coworker stabbing me in the back, but a corrupt system designed to protect predators. This revelation shifted my fight. Now I wasn't just challenging Brian. I was challenging the entire toxic power structure. But exposing someone like Mark? That was going to be even harder. Knowing the stakes were higher, I had to be meticulous. Mark wasn't just any manager, he had influence, allies, and a reputation for crushing dissent. I reached out to more colleagues, quietly gathering evidence of Mark's favoritism, intimidation tactics, and involvement in Brian's scheme. I found emails where Mark explicitly pushed for Brian's promotion, despite knowing about his misconduct. I organized everything into a detailed dossier and presented it to the company's highest ethics committee, this time with no anonymity. I was ready to put my name and reputation on the line. The investigation was intense. Meetings, interviews, even confrontations behind closed doors. But the proof was overwhelming. Eventually, Mark was suspended pending review. For the first time in years, it felt like real accountability was happening. But the battle took a toll. My workload doubled as colleagues hesitated to fully trust me again. And some whispered that I was stirring up trouble. Still, I stood my ground. Because sometimes, changing a toxic culture means becoming the target yourself. And if that's the price of truth, then it's a price worth paying. Looking back, this whole ordeal taught me more than just how to navigate office politics. It showed me the importance of resilience, of standing up even when the odds are against you. I learned that trust is precious, but it needs to be earned and protected. And I realized that toxic environments don't change overnight, but they can be challenged, one step at a time. I'm not here to say my story has a perfect, happy ending. The scars of betrayal still linger. Some friendships never fully healed. And the company? It's slowly trying to rebuild, but the wounds run deep. But what I can say is this: I refuse to be a victim. I refuse to let Brian, or anyone else, define my worth or my future. If you're dealing with something similar, remember, you're not alone. And sometimes, the hardest battles lead to the most important victories. Thank you for listening. If you found value in this story, please subscribe for more real workplace stories, raw, honest, and unfiltered. Because we all deserve to be heard. And sometimes, sharing our stories is the first step to healing.